All right, back again for chapters 5 and 6, and this will wrap up. I was going to say this video, but this has been 3 videos. So we'll wrap up this series of videos on the first half of book 1. Okay, so what he's going to say is that we can figure out what people think of as a good life, or what people think of as the highest good, by looking at the kind of lives they lead or that they claim they want to lead. And we have 3 such lives. We have the life of pleasure, we have the political life, and we have the contemplative life, or contemplative life. And those were the 3 examples I used here. Pleasure, public virtue, what they're translating here as the political life is going to really be the life of public engagement. What we mean by political now is a much more narrow, much less laudable pursuit than what Aristotle had in mind by political. So I'm going to talk about public virtue or public engagement or virtuous public engagement, things like that. That's what he's talking about. Someone who is active socially in order to take a leadership position in their community and help guide the community towards, good consequences, things like that. And then there's the life of contemplation. He's going to have a lot more to say about that. These are the 3 lives that stand out as potential accounts of what the eudaimon life is going to be like. And he's going to rule out, seemingly, 2 of them in this chapter, this very early chapter, right? So there's 10 books, I believe, to the Nicomachean Ethics, and this is less than halfway through book 1, and he's going to rule out 2 of them. But he's not really going to rule out 2 of them. He's going to basically rule out pleasure, although he's going to return to pleasure much later on in the book, in the Nicomachean Ethics. And he's going to claim to rule out the political life, but he's going to have a lot to say about that. He's going to end up with a position that looks like it says the political life is a good life. It's a eudaimon life. But he's going to make initial criticisms of 2 out of these 3 lives, and it is from looking at those criticisms that we can understand a little bit about the constraints that Aristotle places on the good life. The first criticism is directed towards the life of pleasure, and he says, now the mass of mankind are evidently quite slavish in their tastes, preferring a life suitable to beasts. This is the life of pleasure. What Aristotle is saying, his criticism of the life of pleasure as being the happy life, the flourishing life, the eudaimon life, is that it doesn't seem appropriate for human beings. It seems appropriate for animals. We're going to see when we get to chapter 7, I believe, of book 1, that he's going to have an argument about the good life for human being a distinctively human life. We'll get to that later, but this is sort of a clue about where things are going. It's kind of foreshadowing. Aristotle's going to say the highest good is going to be different for different species, right? So there's not just one good for all things. The way that it seems like Plato must have thought there was, the form of the good is the form of the good no matter what kind of organism you are. But Aristotle's going to say, no, the life of pleasure, that's the right life for animals. That's a good life for animals, but it's not a good life for us. The criticism of the political life, or the life of virtuous public engagement, is a little complicated. What it ends up turning into is a 2-part criticism. And here I'll go to here. I'll make a little list so that we keep this in mind. So we have the life of pleasure, and that is criticized as being fit only for animals. He says beasts. Aristotle would have recognized that human beings were animals. I'm just using the word animals colloquially. Of course, human beings are animals. And then there's the life of politics or political engagement. And Aristotle has 2 different accounts he's going to give of what it is that people are after in the political life. One is honor, right? So he thinks some people engage in a politically active life, an engaged political or social life, in order to get honor. And nowadays, again, so I'm harping on language a lot here because there's a big gap between us and Aristotle in time. So translation becomes a tricky thing. We now think of honor as a much more restricted thing than Aristotle thought of it. You could think of honor as just any kind of esteem you're held in by other people. So, one reason you might have to live a politically engaged life, a life in which you are active with other people, in which you take leadership roles and things like that in clubs and organizations, politically even, is to be thought well of by other people, to have other people respect you, to have other people think well of you, right? Aristotle's going to say that if that's what you're after, then there's a problem. And the problem is it's too dependent on other people. If you're involved politically and socially, and you're doing that to get honor, then you're chasing the wrong thing because the a life of, or rather, honor can't be the highest good. So the idea is people show that the life of active political engagement is important by pursuing it. What are they after? What's the good that corresponds to that life? Well, the good that corresponds to that life is honor, but that can't be the highest good. And the reason is that it leaves your status as being happy or not, as having the highest good or not, too dependent on sort of fate, on things outside of your control. So what we see here is that while Aristotle was willing to say that luck can enter into whether or not you can become a good person, by, for example, you can be unlucky in how you were raised. Like if you're just stuck with crappy parents, Aristotle seems to think it's over for you. You're not going to do well in life. But on the other hand, he's not going to let luck in anywhere. And the problem with honor is that it makes the honor as the highest good is it makes whether or not your life is a good life depend on what other people think of you. But what if you're surrounded by just assholes, right? What if you live in a city, you live in a society where people have the wrong values? Then you won't be honored. I'll use the example of Oskar Schindler from Schindler's List. After World War II, Oskar Schindler, who had saved over 1,000 European Jews from the Holocaust, when he lived in Germany, and he didn't live in Germany for the rest of his life. He went to Argentina like a lot of Germans did, but he eventually ran out of money. He ended up back in Germany. They would like pour urine on his head, right? People would empty out their pots with urine and like feces in it so that it would hit him. They would like throw rocks at him. He did a good thing. He did a thing that merited honor, merited respect, but he didn't actually get it because he was surrounded by people who had had their whole conception of what was good in life so perverted by the decades they'd spent under Nazism that he couldn't be honored by his own people. He had to go to the new state of Israel to find people who honored him and respect him. And eventually he ended up living about half his life in Israel, half of the rest of his life in Israel, half of the rest of his life in Germany. So it seems like honor can't be the highest good because then it would say that like Oskar Schindler's life sucked after the war. And in a sense it did, but in another sense it didn't. He was a great man who had done great things. And what Aristotle thinks is it just can't be up to who you're surrounded by to determine whether or not your life's a good life. So honor's out. Another thing you might be after, though, is virtue. Okay, so part of the problem with pursuing honor as a good is it, like if you're surrounded by bad people, you're not going to be honored. If people turn bad, right, then they won't honor you, and then you'll have lost the good life through no bad action of your own. So Aristotle points out maybe what people are after when they're after honor isn't really honor, but being a good person, right? To being the kind of person who deserves to be honored, which basically means that the end of a politically engaged life, the goal of it, would be virtue. He says virtue can't be the highest good either because it's incomplete. For possession of virtue seems actually compatible with being asleep, with lifelong inactivity, And further, with the greatest sufferings and misfortunes, but a man who was living so no one would call him happy. But a man who was living so, no one would call happy unless he were maintaining a thesis at all costs. So the point here is you could be like in a coma and still be a virtuous person because virtue is a disposition. You could have a disposition to behave well, to do the right thing, and thus be virtuous, but never have the opportunity because, you're out of it. Right? You're in a coma. Or maybe you just never have the opportunity because you never are in the situation to exercise your virtues somehow, a life of inactivity. Or maybe you're virtuous and you're suffering horribly. The point here is that virtue isn't sufficient for a good life because seemingly you can't be having a good life if you're undergoing great sufferings, if you're not given an opportunity to exercise your virtue. Here, Aristotle is maybe disagreeing with Plato. At various points in Plato's works, Plato suggests that a person who is fully just will be happy no matter what, that justice, and remember Plato thought if you had one virtue, you had all the others. So having all the virtues meant you were happy, meant you were living a good life, even if you're being tortured. Plato kind of uses that example in the Republic, and here Aristotle seems to be saying, no, like, if you're a really good person, but you're being tortured and you're suffering horrible misfortunes, you're just not living a good life. What we see here is Plato seemed to think if you're virtuous, or at certain points, Plato seemed to think that if you were virtuous, then you were living a good life. You were kind of guaranteed of it. And Aristotle's saying, no, that's not the case. Aristotle then says he's going to come back to the contemplative life later, or contemplative life later. The last little bit of chapter 5 is he says money making, a life of money making, just can't be the good life. Right? So this is one step down from a life of pleasure or political engagement or contemplation. All of those could be a good life. The contrast with money making is it appears that money making is pursuing something that just isn't a final good. So remember that a final good is something that you value for its own sake. It's something that can be at the top of the pyramid or a pyramid, right? And pleasure, virtue, and contemplation can all be that, Aristotle thinks. They're all valuable in themselves. But money's just not. You only want money to get something else. So the life of money making just can't be, like it's not even a candidate for the good life. So we've got pleasure, virtue, and contemplation as the potential highest goods. Pleasure and virtue have both been given criticisms initially. Contemplation hasn't been given any so far, but keep in mind that if the highest good is an inclusive good, the fact that pleasure by itself can't be the highest good, the fact that public virtue by itself can't be the highest good, doesn't mean they're not part of the highest good. It just means they're not sufficient on their own. All right, the last chapter is chapter 6. Not actually going to spend much time on that because there's a whole lot going on in there that you don't need to know about, but there are a couple points I want to cover. All right, chapter 6, and then we're done. Well, with the first half of it, we're done. Chapter 6 is an extended criticism of Plato's views on the nature of the good. He already brought up Plato's views on the nature of the good earlier when he said there were some people who thought there was one good thing in virtue of which everything was good. That's the form of the good. It's a thing Plato was talking about in the Republic around the allegory of the cave section. This is going to be, chapter 6, an extended discussion of all the problems with the idea of the form of the good, and we're not going to go through all of them. Relative to the earlier chapters, chapter 6 is a fairly long chapter, and it's one of the most difficult chapters to understand. A lot of what's going on in here is unclear. I'm not going to go line by line through it. You don't need to know much about what in particular Aristotle says here. Aristotle is condensing a whole lot of arguments into a short section because he wants to put them aside and get on with it. There is this nice little part of it, though, where he talks about the fact that the forms have been introduced by friends of our own. And Aristotle is reluctant to criticize his friends. But he says, yet it would perhaps be thought to be better indeed to be our duty for the sake of maintaining the truth, even to destroy what touches us closely, especially as we are philosophers or lovers of wisdom. For while both are dear, piety requires us to honor truth above our friends. So it's really clear that Aristotle is like not happy with the fact that he has to criticize Plato. The relationship between Plato and Aristotle is one of those things people like to speculate about. Aristotle went to the academy, Plato's university, studied there from the age of 14 until I believe he was close to 40, maybe even a little older than 40 when Plato died. Aristotle clearly thought he should be in charge, or there's a story that Aristotle thought he should be in charge of the academy after Plato died, thought of himself as Plato's natural successor. And passages like this let us know that probably part of what was behind that is their relationship was a good one. It wasn't a contentious teacher-student relationship, even though they did disagree about a lot. So, the main criticism I want to draw your attention to in chapter 6 is he says, further, since one of the things answering to one idea is a translation people use for form. It's a bad translation, but further, since one of the things answering to one idea, there is one science. There would have been one science of all the goods. But as it were, there are many sciences, even of the things that fall under one category. For example, of opportunity. For opportunity in war is studied by strategics, and in disease by medicine. And the moderate in food is studied by medicine, and in exercise by the science of gymnastics. So what Aristotle is saying here, and this is part of the evidence, by the way, that the account of the highest good that he favors is the inclusive good, is that there's just too many different ways for something to be good, for there to be one science of them all, for there to be one object of study. Right? So what he's saying is there's not just one thing that's good. There's many things that are good, too many things, for it to be plausible that the good is just this one thing, the form of the good, whatever that was, the thing that Plato never really described, he just said was out there. And this, I think, is some evidence that Aristotle's not committed to there being one highest good. Right? I mean, in a sense he is, because he says eudaimonia is the highest good. But then he goes right into saying nobody agrees what eudaimonia is. And the position he's going to end up on, it seems, is one where there's a bunch of different final goods, and the highest good is just having them all, or having as much of them as you can. And that because that's the situation, there can't be one fundamental nature to goodness. There's many different good things. And we're going to see why that's the case as we move forward with the Nicomachean Ethics. But for now, we're done.